Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding in Mishnah Berurah Chelik Beis, and we will be learning today Mir Hashem Daf Samach Tes Amud Aleph. We are continuing to learn Hilchos B'tzias HaPas, and we will pick up today on Samach Ches Amud Beis near the end of Siman Kuf Samach Ches Sif Yud. We have been discussing the topic of Chavitza, and I'll give a little bit of a brief recap in a moment. Before we begin our learning, of course, our learning should serve as a schus for Achenu Kol Beis Yisrael, Hanesunim B'Tzara B'Shivya Ha'imdim Bein Bayam Ubein Bayabasha Hamakim Yerachem Aleihem V'Yotziam Mitzara L'Rvacha Me'afela La'ira Umishibed L'Geula Hashta Bagala Uzman Kariv V'Nemar Amen. Our learning should also serve as a schus for Refuah Shalema for Gavriel Ben Bella Rivka, for Ariel Yosef ben Miriam Rezel and Meir ben Chaya Sarah, all of whom are in need of Rachamei Shamayim. So, we've been discussing the question of this dish called Chavitza, which the Mechaber has told us is a dish that's prepared out of pieces of pas, pieces of bread. So we have real bread. We're not talking about pasa babakistan. We're not talking about cake. We're not talking about crackers. We're not talking about pretzels. We're talking about real bona fide 100% bread. So somebody made a dish that is prepared out of pieces of bread. There are different ways to prepare such a dish. Scenario number one that we have discussed is you took bread, you broke it into pieces, you put it into a liquid, and then you went ahead and you cooked it. So that is a cooked chavitza. Now, once you cook bread in a liquid, the assumption is that we lose tayar lechem. We lose the appearance of bread. Now, since we cooked it and we lost tayar lechem, the determining factor over here of what the berachah rishona and what the berachah achrona should be is going to be the size of the pieces. If you made this chavitza out of pieces that are at least a kazayas, or like we saw in the Mishnah Berurah, if there is at least one piece of bread in this chavitza that is a kazayas, and what does that mean that it's a kazayas? It means that it was a kazayas. When I broke my bread apart, I had a piece that was a kazayas, and I put it in and I cooked it, and after the cooking, it remained a kazayas, right? So if there's at least one piece in there that's a kazayas, we need to wash on lutilas yadayim. We need to make hamoitzi on the piece that's a kazayas. Once we make hamoitzi on the piece that's a kazayas, we're going to pater all the rest of the pieces, even the pieces that are less, including the pieces that are less than a kazayas. And if we eat a kazayas of this cooked chavitza dish, we're going to have to make berachas hamazayin as the nach bracha, the bracha achrona. So that's if we have a cooked chavitza and we have pieces, or at least one piece, that is the size of a kazayas. Since it's bona fide lechem, even though we lost tayar lechem because we cooked it, but since it's a kazayas, it doesn't lose the shem pas, and since it retains the shem pas, we have to make a hamoitzi. Now, let's say we have this cooked chavitza, but we don't have a piece that's a kazayas. Let's say we have a cooked chavitza, and all of the pieces are less than a kazayas. If all of the pieces are less than a kazayas, now the halacha is going to be that we're going to make a mezainos and a bracha ma'achas me'ein shalosh as the nach bracha. And that's true even if you're going to look at the dish and you're going to say, I think there's tayar lechem over here. It doesn't matter. Why? Because once you cook the bread, we assume that there is no tayar lechem. We no longer call it pas. We call it a tavshil. We call it a cooked dish. And therefore, since it's a grain-based dish, the bracha rishona is going to be mezainos, and the bracha achrona is going to be a bracha achas me'in shalosh. So that's chavitza scenario number one. That is a cooked chavitza. Then we saw in the Mechaber chavitza type 2. Chavitza type 2 is where, again, we take bona fide bread, we take rye bread, we take maybe matzah, we take challah, we break it up into pieces, but now we're not going to cook it. Now we're going to put it into some kind of a liquid. We saw mentioned maybe dvash, maybe honey, maybe it's some other kind of liquid. We had mentioned marak, which means just some kind of a sauce or a beverage or gravy, maybe eggs, maybe oil. So you take your pieces of pas and you combine it with some kind of a liquid agent. You combine it kind of into a mass. But now you didn't cook it. And because you didn't cook it, it's possible that you will retain tayar lechem. So now we look at this, and again, we have to look. Do we have at least one piece that's the size of a kezayis? If we have a piece that's the size of a kezayis, again, the berachah is going to be hamaitzi and berachas hamazon. You'll find that piece that's a kezayis. And again, what do we mean a piece that's a kezayis? We mean a piece that was a kezayis, still is a kezayis. We don't mean that you have 6 pieces that got globbed together with the honey and got stuck together and now it's a kezayis. No, we mean that the original pieces that you formed this mass out of, you have a piece that originally was a kezayis and still is a kezayis. If you have a piece that's a kezayis, you're going to wash the tils yadayim, make hamaitzi on that piece that's a kezayis, you're going to pater everything else, and then the nach bracha is going to be berachas hamazon. If, however, there are no pieces that are a kezayis, if everything is smaller than a kezayis, and like I keep on saying, let's say a knedel. Obviously, when you make knedlach, all of the pieces are less, well, knedlach are cooked, I'm sorry, wrong scenario. Knedlach belong to scenario number 1. We're talking about scenario number 2 where there's no cooking. So if all of the pieces of this uncooked chavitza, if everything was made out of pieces that are less than a kezayis, then we have to look at tayar lechem. If we still have tayar lechem, because we didn't cook it, so maybe there still is tayar lechem. If we still have tayar lechem, then we go ahead and we make hamaitzi and berachas hamazon, even though it's less than a kezayis. Why? Because over here we're talking about something that wasn't cooked. It still could have tayar lechem. In scenario number 1, we were talking about a chavitza that was cooked. A chavitza that was cooked, there's no tayar lechem. I don't care if you think there's tayar lechem. A chavitza that was cooked, there's no tayar lechem. So once the pieces are less than a kezayis, it's a bezonos. But over here in scenario number 2, it's not cooked. It's just combined with a liquid binder. In that case, if the pieces are more than a kezayis, we need to wash because the pieces are more than kezayis. We need to wash. We need to make hamaitzi. We need to make berachas hamazon. If the pieces are less than a kezayis, we have to look to tayar lechem. If we have tayar lechem, netilas yadayim hamaitzi berachas hamazon. If we do not have tayar lechem, then less than a kezayis, no tayar lechem, mezainos bracha achas me'ein shalish. That's what we've seen so far. Now we're going to turn to scenario number 3. So we pick up on Samaches Amid Beis, and we are 2 lines off the bottom, right near the second word on the line, V'im. Says the Mechaber, and this is going to be scenario number 3, which is not complicated at all. V'im einoi loy mavushal v'loy mechuber. Let's say you have pieces of bread that are not cooked. You didn't put it in a liquid and cook it. V'loy mechuber. Nor are they combined using any kind of a binder. Ela mifarer dak dak. But what you have is, you have matzah, or you have challah, or you have rye bread that was crumbled dak dak into tiny little pieces. Matzah meal. So you got a box of matzah meal. V'meina loy mavushal. It's not cooked. V'loy mechuber. It's not combined together. Ela mifarer dak dak. It's crumbled very, very small. Afal pi she'ein by kezayis. Even though over here you don't have pieces that are a kezayis, you look at a box of matzah meal, there are no pieces that are a kezayis. V'loy tayar lechem, you also don't have tayar lechem. Nobody's going to look at a box of matzah meal and says, yeah, that looks like bread to me. No, it doesn't. Maybe it looks like bread crumbs. Maybe it looks like matzah crumbs, but it's crumbs, it's not bread. You can't say that there's tayar lechem. No one's going to look at that and say it looks like a loaf of bread. So you don't have a kezayis. You don't have tayar lechem. Still, says the Mechaber, Mevarech alav hamoitziu berachas hamazon. You want to take a spoon and you want to dig into a box of matzah meal and you want to eat matzah meal, you gotta go wash the tilas yadayim, you gotta make hamoitzi, and the Ramah says, V'ayin l'kaman simin kuf pei daled kama shir achila levarech aleh berachas hamazon. If you eat a kazayas, you're gonna have to bench. So very interesting. In scenario number 1, where we cooked the pieces of bread, the driving factor ended up being the size of the pieces of bread. Because again, when we cook the bread in a liquid, our assumption is we lose tayar lechem. So once we cook it, the driving factor becomes the size of the pieces. If you have a piece that's a kazayas, you got to make hamoitzi and berachas hamazon. If you have pieces that are less than a kazayas, then you don't have a kazayas, you don't have tayar lechem, and therefore it becomes a mezainos. In scenario number 2, where we didn't cook it, the driving factor becomes both size and tayar lechem. What do I mean? Well, if you have pieces that are a kazayas, again, netilas yadayim, hamoitzi, berachas hamazon. If you have pieces that are less than a kazayas, then the driving factor is tayar lechem. Since you didn't cook it, maybe you retained tayar lechem. If you retained tayar lechem, even if the pieces are less than a kazayas, you make hamoitzi. In scenario number 3, we have neither kazayas nor tayar lechem. Matzah meal, you don't have a kazayas, you don't have tayar lechem. Yet the halacha over there is netilas yadayim hamoitzi and berachas hamazon. Why? Because you did not change the pas. It's true that you don't have a kazayas. It's true that you don't even have tayar lechem. But why don't you have tayar lechem? It's not that you don't have tayar lechem because you changed the bread. In the scenario number 1, you cooked it. You cooked the bread. You made a shinui in the bread. You took off tayar lechem by virtue of the fact that you cooked it. Now you changed the bread. It's not considered pas anymore. It doesn't have a shame pas. So if the pieces are less than a kazayas and it doesn't have tayar lechem because you made a shinui, you're going to make them a zainos. In scenario number 2, where you didn't cook it, but you still combined it using a liquid binding agent, again you made a shinui. That's also considered a shinui. So now it depends. If you're dealing with pieces less than a kazayas, it depends. Your shinui that you made, was it enough to take off tayar lechem? If it was enough to take off tayar lechem, so you don't have kazayas, you don't have tayar lechem, you make a bezainos. But in scenario number 3, where you took matzah, you made matzah meal, that's not a shinui in the pas. You didn't change the pas. The only reason it doesn't have tayar lechem is because you ground it up very small. Now, you might be looking at me, or at least looking at your computer screen or your phone screen, and you might be saying, Rabbi Weiss, I didn't make a shinoi? Of course I made a shinoi. I had a matzah, I dropped it into a food processor or into a grinder, and I changed it into crumbs. What do you mean I didn't make a shinoi? I'll tell you what I mean I didn't make a shinoi. Let's analyze this for a minute. Okay, you sit down by your Shabbos table Friday night. You take 2 beautiful challahs that your wife baked, and you say berachos, Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam hamoitzi lechem min haaretz. You take the challah knife and you cut the challah in half. Did you make a shinui? No, you didn't make a shinui. Cutting the challah in half does not constitute making a shinui. You cut it in quarters. Did you make a shinui? No, you didn't make a shinui. You take the challah and you slice it up into slices for your whole family. Did you make a shinui? No, you didn't make a shinui. Guess what? When you drop it into a food processor or you drop it into a grinder, you're cutting it. Now you're cutting it into smaller pieces, but that's not changing the physicality of the pas. You're not affecting a shinui in the pas. You're just making it into smaller pieces. And therefore, it was pas and it remains pas. So that's scenario number 3. Now let's go into the Mishnah Berurah, and we're going to see a very interesting addition to scenario number 3, which we're going to have to pay attention to because it's going to carry us through the first part of Samach Tes Amud Aleph. Says the Mishnah Berurah in Ois Katan Samach. That's the first Ois Katan of the Mishnah Berurah that deals with scenario number 3. The Mechaber said on scenario number 3, if you took pas and you did not cook it, nor did you combine it using any kind of liquid agent, all you did was you chopped it up dak. You turned it into matzah meal. So then the Mechaber said, even though it's not a kezayis and you don't have Torah lechem, still the bracha is hamoitzi. Says the Mechaber, says the Mishnah Berurah, says the Chavetz Chaim on the bottom line of the Mishnah Berurah, Samach Chesem and Beis, ois katan samach, v'loi Torah lechem. You don't have Torah lechem. Says the Chavetz Chaim, why don't you have Torah lechem? Hainu, shal yedei shehu mefarer dak kisoilis, since you ground it up very fine like flour, loy minkar alav Torah lechem. It's not, you cannot recognize in it the appearance of bread. Like I said, you don't look at a box of matzah meal and say it looks like a loaf of rye bread, or it looks like a matzah. Va'atam, and the reason for this halacha, the reason for that, despite the fact you don't have Torah lechem and you don't have kezayis, the bracha still remains hamoitzi. Says the Chavetz Chaim V'atam, the reason for this is dekeven shu pas b'fnei atzmai, because since it is bread and bread alone, you didn't add any other ingredients, you didn't combine it with anything. All it is bread. Keven shu pas b'fnei atzmai ve'enoi mechuber, nor did you congeal it into some kind of a mass using a binding agent. Nothing happened to it that changes it from lechem. You did not make a shinui that would change it from being lechem. Now, here's the piece that I'm saying. Let's pay careful attention to this. Va'ayin ba'achroinim. Says the Chavetz Chaim, take a look at the Achroinim. Take a look at the Maimon Mordechai, the Graz, the Magin Giborim. Take a look at the Achroinim. Sheskibu, who reach a consensus. Da'afilu shara hapirurin b'mayim. Even if you would take these small pieces of bread that are less than a kezayis, okay, and you would soak them in water. Da'afilu shara hapirurin b'mayim. Kevan shaloi nischabru yachad, as long as they don't join each other and form a mass, you just soaked it in water. Eino yoytze mitaras pas. It still remains pas. Okay? So, scenario number 3 in the Mechaber did not speak about adding any other ingredients or any kind of soaking. Scenario number 1 was cooking. Scenario number 2 was binding with a liquid agent, but binding with a liquid agent. Scenario number 3 was all you did was chop up the bread. Now the Mishnah Berurah says the halacha of scenario number 3, where if you grind up matzah, you grind up bread, you grind up challah, even into tiny, tiny pieces, but pieces less than a kezayis, it retains the bracha of hamoitzi and berachos hamazon. That extends even if you took the pieces and you soaked them in water, so long as they didn't clump into one mass. Also, we're going to see it's only true if you soaked it for a short time. But it says the Mishnah Berurah inside, Vayin b'achroinim sheskimu da'afilu shara pirurin b'mayim. Even if you soak the pieces of bread in water, kevan shaloi nischabru yachad, since they didn't join into one mass, eino yoytze mitaras pas. That does not constitute a shinoi, and it remains pas. It remains bread, and the bracha is hamoitzi and berachos hamazon. The dafka im sharas man muat. However, this is only true if you soaked it for a short amount of time. Avalim showa pirurin b'soicham. But if you soaked the pieces in water, ad shenislabdu hamayim al yedei, for a long enough amount of time that the water you're soaking the bread in started to turn white. That doesn't mean white, like white paint. It means it's all cloudy and whitish. Mivur b'sif sha'acharav. We are going to see clearly in Sif Yod Aleph, the mevarech alav barei min mezainos ubracha mein shalosh. Then it becomes mezainos and alamichya. So again, scenario number 3, if we join what the Mechaber said with what the Mishnah Berurah just told us. If you take bread, challah, matzah, you grind it up into small pieces less than a kezayis, even if you grind it up mamish into matzah meal, even if you take bread and you grind it up into something that already looks like flour, you go ahead and you want to eat a teaspoon of it, you did not make a shinui over here, it is still called pas, you got to wash it till it's yadayim, you have to make hamoitzi, you have to make berachos hamazon if you ate a kezayis of it. Adds the Mishnah Berurah, this is true even if you took these pieces and you soaked them in water for a short amount of time. If you soaked them in water for a short amount of time and they didn't congeal into a mass and the water did not turn white, again, you did not make a shinoi. You just have wet bread. And on wet bread, you make the tils yadayim hamaitzi and berachos hamazon. But if you soaked it for a long enough amount of time that the water started to turn white, now already that's a siman that you lost tayar lechem. That's what we're going to see. If you soak the bread in water long enough that the water starts to turn white, that's almost like cooking the bread. Cooking the bread takes away tayar lechem. Soaking the bread long enough that the water turns white also takes away tayar lechem. So if you do that to pieces that are less than a kazayis, it's like cooking pieces that are less than a kazayis, in which case you lose tayar lechem, berachah rishayna mezainos, berachah achrayna, berachos hamazon. Now, against that backdrop, let's go right into Sif Yod Aleph, top line, Samach Tesam and Aleph. Says the Machaber, Yesh mi she'omer. There is one that says, this is actually Tosfos and the Mordechai, if you'll take a look in the Be'er HaGoyla. Yesh mi she'omer. There are those that say, the perurin. If you have pieces of bread or crumbs, but we're speaking about pieces that are less than a kazayis. Yesh mi she'omer. There are those that say, the perurin. Crumbs of bread, pieces that are less than a kazayis. Shenoistin b'mayim. That you put into water. V'hamayim mislabnim machmas haperurin, and the water starts to turn white because of the pieces of bread that you put into the water. Ozole toirisa. We lose the toirisa. What's toirisa? Says the Ramah. Pirish, what this word means is ki'ilu oimar toyarisa. The word is not really toirisa, it's toyarisa, kiloimar, which means tayar lechem. It means tayar lechem. Now let's read the Machaber straight without those parentheses. So yesh mi she'omer de piruin shenois to b'mayim v'amayim mislabden machmas piruin. There are those that say that if you put crumbs or small pieces of bread, less than a kazayas, into water and the water turns white because of the addition of the bread, ozale terusa denama. Nama is bread. Ozale terusa denama, you lose the tayar lechem. So basically what the Machaber is telling you is, there are those that say that soaking bread for a long enough amount of time that the water starts to turn white is akin to cooking bread. The same way when you cook bread in liquid, we said the assumption is that you lose tayar lechem. If you soak bread in a liquid long enough that the liquid turns white, guess what? You lose tayar lechem. And if you do that to pieces that are less than a kazayas, the bracha becomes mezainos and bracha achas mein shalosh, just like we saw in scenario number 1 by a cooked chavitza. If you make a cooked chavitza, if you cook pieces that are less than a kazayas, the assumption is you lost the tayar lechem, and therefore bracha rishayna mezainos, bracha achrayna, bracha achas mein shalosh. Yesh mi she'omer, says the Machaber here in Sif Yod Aleph, that if you soak pieces of bread that are less than a kazayas, it's the same thing as cooking them. Why? If you soak it long enough that the liquid turns white, you lose tayar lechem. Okay, so if you have pieces that are less than a kazayas, and you made a shinoi because you soaked it, and you lost tayar lechem, bracha rishayna mezainos, bracha achrayna, bracha achas mein shalosh. So again, I'm just going to read the Machaber inside, Sif Yod Aleph, yesh mi she'omer de perurin shenoistin b'mayim. Crumbs, small pieces, less than a kazayis, that you put into water. V'amayim mislabden machmas hapirurin, and the water turns white because of the addition of the crumbs. Ozale terusa denama, you lose tayar lechem, and therefore vein mevarach aleh ela bari mina mezainos. The bracha rishayna becomes bari mina mezainos. Ubracha achas mein shalosh. The bracha achrayna is al hamichya. Says the Mishnah Berurah ois katan samach aleph. The perurin shenoistin, right away, says the Chavetz Chaim, understand hainu kishein behem kazayis. Understand that the Machaber is talking about pieces that are smaller than the kazayas. The ilu yesh behem kazayas, if we're talking about pieces that are kazayas or larger, ain't tzarich tayar lechem. We don't need tayar lechem If we're dealing with pieces that are bigger than a kezayis, we don't need Torah lechem in order for it to be hamoitzi. Scenario number one, a cooked chavitza. If you cooked pieces of bread that are bigger than a kezayis, you lost Torah lechem, but you still make hamoitzi. So too over here, if you soaked pieces in water and the water turned white, but the pieces are bigger than kezayis, certainly you're going to make hamoitzi, like we saw in Sif Yud. Oiskat and Samach Beis, the Mechaber talked about b'mayim, where you soaked these crumbs or these pieces of bread that are less than a kezayis in water. Okay, says the Chavetz Chaim, v'hanoiste b'chatichas pas shemiyabshin al hagecholim. If somebody takes toast, now they didn't make toast in toasters. They made toast, they took bread, and they dried it on coals. So v'hanoiste b'chatichas pas, somebody who puts pieces of bread, shemiyabshin al hagecholim, that they had dried out over hot coals, b'sheichar, into beer. So you take pieces of toast that are smaller than kezayis, and you put them into beer. Shekarin penitz, this was called penitz. Ve'ein be'em kezayis, and the pieces of bread are less than a kezayis. Va'asheichar mislaben al yedei ashriya, and the beer starts to turn white because of the addition of the pieces of bread. Nami dina hachi, same halacha applies. The mavarchen aleim bariminim mezainos. Those pieces of toast become mezainos. So what's the Chavetz Chaim telling me? The Chavetz Chaim is telling me the Mechaber said if you take pieces of bread and you soak them in water and the water turned white, it becomes a mezainos. Says the Chavetz Chaim, guess what? They had a minig of taking pieces of toast, smaller than kezayis, and soaking them in beer, not in water. If the beer turns white, those pieces of toast become mezainos. Let's say you crumbled up mamish tiny pieces of bread and you put it into hot beer. Somehow the breadcrumbs added a certain taste to the hot beer. But you're not doing it to eat the bread. You're doing it because somehow that flavors the beer. Says the Chavetz Chaim, then you make a shahakal on the beer, and you don't make any bracha on the bread. Dehu ha'ikr, because the beer is the ikr. V'halechem, it's not even that the lechem is a tuffle. The lechem is not even a tuffle. V'halechem ein by mamoshus v'davar choshev. The bread is not here. Apparently, what he's talking about over here is you take bread and you mamish make tiny little breadcrumbs and you mamish crumble it up and drop it into the beer, and then you drink the beer and you can't even tell that the breadcrumbs are there. They probably melt away. Somehow it flavors the beer, but the breadcrumbs are mamish not there. So then you make a shahakal on the beer and you potter the breadcrumbs. Ois cut and samach gimel. In this case, where you soak the bread in water and the water turned white, ozolei toirisa denama, we lose Torah lechem. Says the Mishnah Berurah, v'afte bevor b'soif sif hakodim. Even though, and this is why I told you in the beginning of the shir that we had to pay extra special attention to what the Mishnah Berurah said about scenario number 3. The Mishnah Berurah says now over here, what did we just say? We just said, if you soaked bread in water, pieces of bread that are less than a kezayis, if you soaked it in water until the water turned white, you lose Tayar Lechem, and now that you lost Tayar Lechem, you have bread that you made a shinoi in, you soaked it, and you soaked it long enough that the water turned white, so you lost Tayar Lechem, so you don't have kezayis, you don't have Tayar Lechem, and you have a shinoi, and therefore it becomes a mezainos. Now, says the Chavetz Chaim, after mevur b'soif sif hakodim, even though I told you at the end of Sif Yud, in Mishnah Berurah Ois Kat and Samach, on the top of the Mishnah Berurah over here on Samach Tes Amud Aleph, even though I told you over there, the perurin she'ena mevushel, that when you're dealing with crumbs or pieces of bread that are not cooked, v'loy mechuber, nor did they congeal and become bound together in one mass, afilu im ein behem Torah lechem, even if they don't have Torah lechem, mivarech hamoitzi. That was the Mishnah Berurah's addition to the Mechaber's scenario number 3. The Mechaber said in scenario number 3, if you took matzah and you ground it into matzah meal and you want to eat a spoonful of dry matzah meal, you need the tils yadayim hamoitzi and berachos hamazon. The Mishnah Berurah and Ois Kat and Samach added to that, if you would take pieces of matzah or bread or challah that are less than a kazayas and you would soak it in water, but it doesn't become combined into one mass, it's also hamoitzi. That was his extension to scenario number 3. So now the Mishnah Berurah says, but wait a second. Over here in Sif Yud Aleph, the Mechaber is telling me that if you soaked the pieces of bread that are less than a kazayas in water, it becomes a mezainos. Isn't that a stira? Explains the Mishnah Berurah, no, it's not a stira. After bevor beside Sif HaKodim, even though I explained to you at the end of Sif Yud, in Mishnah Berurah is cut and samach, the pirurim she'ena mavushal, that when you're dealing with pieces or crumbs less than a kazayas that are not cooked, v'loy mechuber, nor are they bound together in one mass through a binding agent. Afilu im ein bem tayar lechem, even if they lose tayar lechem, mevarech hamoitzi, you make hamoitzi. Va'afilu ha'yishruyim b'mayim, even if you soak them in water, k'moisha kasav sham, like I wrote over there. Says the Mishnah Berurah, that's dafka hasam. That's only true at the end of Sif Yud. Shaloi nishtanet tzuras hapas be'etzem klal shenishra b'mayim rak zman mu'at. Over there, we were talking about bread that you soaked for a short amount of time. How short? The water didn't turn white. If you soaked it for a short amount of time that the water didn't even turn white, that's not called a shinui in the bread. And if you lost the tayar lechem over there, it's not that you don't have tayar lechem because of the soaking. It's that you don't have tayar lechem because the pieces are tiny. But the soaking didn't cost you the tayar lechem. So over there, even though you soaked the bread, it's called wet bread, and you make hamoitzi. Over here, we're talking about pieces of bread that you soaked for a long enough time that the water turned white. That's a raya that you made a shinui in the bread, and it's not called wet bread anymore. Now you made a shinui where the soaking cost you the tayar lechem. It's not the cutting up into small pieces that cost you the tayar lechem. It's the shinui of the soaking that cost you tayar lechem, and now the berachah becomes mezainos. That's what the Mishnah Berurah says over here. Dafka hasam, it's only over there in Sif Yud, shaloi nishtanet tzuras hapas be'etzem klal shenishra b'mayim, where you didn't lose the appearance because it was soaked in water, rak zman mu'at, it was only soaked for a small amount of time. Umar shaloi minkar b'y tayar lechem, when we were talking about scenario 3 in Sif Yud, the only reason it doesn't have tayar lechem over there is rak mipnei katnusai, only because of the tiny size of the pieces. Masha ein kein hacha, contrast that to over here in Sif Yud Aleph, shenishra harbe b'mayim, where you soak the pieces for a long time in the water, ad shenislabdu hamayim al yedei zeh, where the water already turned white because of the soaking. Hu siman shenifseda tzurasa, the whiteness of the water is a siman, it's an indicator. Shenifseda tzurasa, that you lost the tayar lechem al yedei hashriya, because of the shinui that you made in the bread through the soaking, v'avad mimena shem lechem, and now you lost shem lechem. Okay, before we go on to Sif Yud Beis, let's just recap that quickly. So we had over here in Sif Yud, we had the Mechaber's, the end of Sif Yud, we had the Mechaber's scenario number 3. Scenario number 3 was you took bread, matzah, challah, you crumbled it up, all the pieces are less than a kazayas, maybe you even ground it up fine like flour, aka matzah meal. You want to eat a spoonful of it, dry? The Mechaber said, Netilas Yadayim, hamoitzi, berachos hamazon. Why? Because it's bread. It's bread. You didn't add any other ingredients. You didn't cook it. You didn't soak it and congeal it into a mass. You didn't make a shinui. Basically, it's bread. You just cut it up into very small pieces. Netilas Yadayim, hamoitzi, berachos hamazon. Said the Mishnah Berurah, that's true even if you take the pieces and you soak them in water for a very short time. How short? That the water didn't start to turn white. As long as the water didn't start to turn white, that's an indicator that you did not yet make a shinui in the bread. It's wet bread. Guess what? Wet bread, you make Netilas Yadayim, hamoitzi, and berachos hamazon. Comes along the Mechaber in Sif Yud Aleph. The Mechaber says in Sif Yud Aleph, if you took pieces that are less than a kazayas and you soaked them in water long enough that the water turned white, Now you're making a shinoi in the bread, and you're losing tayar lechem because of the soaking, not because the pieces are small. You're losing tayar lechem because of the soaking. If you lose tayar lechem because of the soaking, now you made a significant shinoi. Now you don't have tayar lechem, you don't have a kezayis. Now the bracha becomes mezainos and bracha achas me'ein shalosh. The Mishnah Berurah added in over here, this isn't only true about water, it's also true if you took bread and you put it in beer. You took bread and you put it in beer, and the beer turns white, the same way the water turning white is a siman, is an indicator that you lost tziras hapas, you lost tayar lechem because of the soaking. If you put it in beer, if the beer turns white, it's also an indicator that you lost tayar lechem due to the soaking. It's a shinoi, you don't have kezayis, you don't have tayar lechem, it's mezainos and al hamichya. Now we could go on to Sif Yud Beis. Sif Yud Beis is a very interesting sif. And part of what's interesting about Sif Yud Beis is not so much the direct halacha of Sif Yud Beis, but what the Mishnah Berurah is going to go into, and what we're going to learn a little bit about Iker, some of the yesodos of Iker and Tafel in Mishnah Berurah Ois Katan Samach Daled. So without further ado, because I really want to get through it, let's do Sif Yud Beis. Says the Mechaber 3 lines off the top on Samach Tes on an Aleph, middle of the line, Sif Yud Beis. Yesh mi she'omer. There are those that say, and this is again in the name of the Mordechai, Yesh mi she'omer. Shepas, if you have bread, and specifically again, we're talking about pieces that are smaller than a kezayis, which the Mechaber himself is going to say at the end of the sif. Yesh mi she'omer, there are those that say, Shepas hashoroi b'yayin, and the Ramah puts in the word odoim. If you take bread, and you take pieces of bread that are less than a kezayis, and you soak them in red wine. Yesh mi she'omer, shepas hashori b'yayin odoim. If you take pieces of bread that are smaller than kezayis and you soak them in red wine, einoi mevarich ela bari min mezainos. The bracha becomes bari min mezainos, or bracha achas me'ein shalosh, and the nach bracha, the bracha achrayna, is going to be an alamichya, a bracha achas me'ein shalosh. Why is this true? Because you lost tayar lechem. Why did you lose tayar lechem? Because there's no such thing as red bread. If you take, let's analyze this. Let's break this down. We're talking about pieces that are less than a kezayis. Okay, what's the halacha when you break up bread into pieces that are less than a kezayis? It depends if you have tayar lechem or you don't have tayar lechem. If you cook them, you lost tayar lechem. If you soak them in water long enough that the water turns white, you don't have tayar lechem. If you combine them with a liquid binding agent, you have to look. Do you have tayar lechem? If you have tayar lechem, it's hamaitzi. If you don't have tayar lechem, it's mezainos. So the rule always is, if you don't have kezayis, the next thing you have to look at is tayar lechem. So says the Mechaber, if you take pieces of bread that are smaller than kezayis and you soak them in red wine, guess what? You lost tayar lechem. Why did you lose tayar lechem? Because it turned red. And it turns out that there's no such thing as red bread. Sounds like a Dr. Seuss book. Red bread. Ned had red bread. I don't know. Now, next time we'll start talking about Tweedle Beetles. Okay, so Yesh mi she'omer, there are those that say, Shepas hashari b'yayin odoim, if you soak pieces of bread that are smaller than kezayis in red wine, einam mevarich ala bari min mezainos, you only make a mezainos. What do you mean you only make a mezainos? Means you don't wash, you don't make a hamaitzi. You only make a mezainos. Ubracha achas me'ein shalosh, and the nach bracha, the bracha achrayna, is going to be an alamichya, a bracha achas me'ein shalosh. And very importantly, says the Mechaber, v'nira, and it would seem she'ein devarav emurim, that the words of the Mordechai only are said, they only apply, ela b'pirurin, only by crumbs, ay b'prusais, or by pieces of bread, she'ein b'chalachas kezayis. Well, you don't have a kezayis. Because if you did have a kezayis, I don't need tayar lechem. If you have a kezayis, then let's go back to scenario number 1, a cooked chavitza. If you cooked pieces that are bigger than a kezayis, you lost tayar lechem, but since you have pieces that are bigger than a kezayis, it's called pas, netils yadayim hamaitzi and berachas hamazon. So this halacha of the Mordechai, that if you soaked pieces in red wine, you only make a mezainos and a bracha achas me'ein shalosh, that's only if the pieces are less than a kezayis. If the pieces are more than a kezayis, I don't care that you lost tayar lechem. You still have to make hamaitzi. Says the Mishnah Berurah Katan Samach Daled. B'yayin odoim, The Ramah stuck in that this halacha is only talking about red wine. Dafka Adaim, it's only red wine. And the reasoning of this halacha is that since the bread turned red because you soaked it in wine, but if you soaked pieces of bread in white wine, so then it's going to depend. If you soaked the bread in red wine, so you lost Tayar Lechem because it turned red. So now you're going to make a mezainos. If you soak the bread in white wine, so you didn't instantly lose the Tayar Lechem because it's white wine. So then what's the halacha? It depends how long you leave it in the white wine. If you leave it in the white wine long enough that the wine changes, remember by water we said, if you soak the bread in the water long enough that the water turns white, that means that you lost the Tayar Lechem of the bread. So too over here by white wine. We're not going to say if you soak it in white wine long enough that the wine turns white, because the wine is already white. It means if you soak the bread long enough in the white wine that the appearance of the wine changes. It turns cloudy. At that point already, if the color of the wine changed by the fact that the bread is soaking in it, that's a siman, that's an indicator that you lost Tayar Lechem, and now the Lechem is going to become a mezainos. Ois cotton samachay, this is a major ois cotton in the Mishnah Berurah. Let's hold on to our seatbelts over here. Ois cotton samachay. Ella barimina mezainos. So the first thing that the Mishnah Berurah points out is this funny turn of phrase of the mechaber, Einay mevarech ella barimina mezainos. You only make the bracha of barimina mezainos, like I told you when I read it inside. Recited alarma, what the mechaber wants to say is, la'afuke shelo yavarech aleh hamoitzi. He's coming to contrast that you don't make a hamoitzi. When he says you only make a mezainos, he means you make a mezainos, not a hamoitzi. Ule'inyan berachos hayayid. Oh, so now the Chavetz Chaim wants to know like this. Okay. So the mechaber just told me a halacha. You took pieces of bread that are less than a kezayis, you soaked them in red wine. We were concentrating on the bracha on the bread. We're saying that the bracha on the bread gets downgraded from hamoitzi to mezainos. Why? Because you lost Tayar Lechem. You have pieces that are less than a kezayis, and you lost Tayar Lechem because it turned red. So now you get downgraded from hamoitzi to mezainos. But now the Chavetz Chaim wants to know, how about the bracha on the wine? You soaked bread in wine, and you're eating bread soaked in wine. Do you need to make a bracha on the wine? Says the Mishnah Berurah like this. When it comes to the question of the bracha on the wine, if your kavana over here is that you want to eat the bread, and the fact that you soaked the bread in wine was only to flavor the bread a little bit. So you want to eat bread. Let me ask you something. When you take bread and you put on butter, what are you really doing? You're flavoring the bread. You don't want to eat butter. You're not putting butter on the bread because you want to eat butter. You're putting butter on the bread because you want to add some flavor to the bread. So the butter is very clearly a tuffle to the bread. You don't make a bracha on the butter. You only make a bracha on the bread. Says the Chavetz Chaim, if you soaked the pas in the yayin, because you want to eat pas, but the pas is bland. So you wanted to flavor the bread a little bit. So then, v'hayayin bar rak lamate ka'achila, nasa hayayin tuffle. The yayin is very clearly a tuffle. It's secondary to the bread. Ve'enim avarach kiyim barim in mezainos ala pas. So you're only going to make a mezainos on the pas. Remember, you're making a mezainos on the pas because you lost Tayar Lechem and it's less than a kezayis. So you're going to make a mezainos on the pas, and you're going to patter the yayin with the bracha of mezainos on the pas. V'chein, similarly, says the Chavetz Chaim, hashoyre pas kisnin b'yayin, somebody who takes cake or a kichel and he sticks it, he dunks it into wine, oy b'yayin saraf, or into schnapps, but he's doing it to flavor the kichel or to flavor the cake. Not because he wants schnapps, not because he wants yayin. He just wants to flavor his kichel. Gab kein dina hachi. Same halacha would apply. You make a mezainos on the kichel, you make a mezainos on the cake, and you don't worry about the schnapps or the yayin. The cholchkein certainly, says the Chavetz Chaim, hashoyre prusais sheyesh b'hem kezayis. Certainly, if you're taking pieces of bread that are kezayis, where The bracha is hamoitzi. I don't care what you did to it. I don't care if you lost tayar lechem. If you're dealing with pieces of bread that are bigger than a kazayas, or you took pieces of bread and you soaked them in white wine, the mavarek hamoitzi, where we said you didn't lose tayar lechem, so you make hamoitzi. Afilu al prusa she'ein behem kazayas, right? If you soaked pieces of bread that are smaller than a kazayas in yayin lavan, in white wine, for a short amount of time, so that the white wine didn't become cloudy, right? So you didn't lose tayar lechem. Even though it's less than a kazayis, you make hamoitzi. So what's the Chavetz Chaim saying? The Chavetz Chaim is saying like this. I just told you, if you dunked pasa babakistin of some mezainos, right? You dunked it into wine, and you're doing it just because you want to flavor the kichel a little bit. You want to flavor the cake a little bit. You make a mezainos, and you pater the schnapps, you pater the wine. Certainly, says the Chavetz Chaim, if you're dealing with something that you're going to make a hamoitzi on, if you're dealing with pieces that are bigger than a kazayas, or you're dealing with pieces that are smaller than a kazayas, but you soaked them in white wine for a short enough amount of time that you didn't lose tar lechem, so you're going to make a hamoitzi, the chanal, bevadai nasa hayayin tafel pas. Over there, we're talking about hamoitzi. We're not just talking about mezainos, we're talking about hamoitzi. Certainly, if you're dealing with hamoitzi, whatever you dunked it in becomes a tafel. Aval, however, says the Chavetz Chaim, fasten your seatbelts, hold on to your hats, whatever idiom you want to use. Aval, however, im kavanasa gam b'shvil shtiyas hayayin. Let's say you're dunking something into wine, not just to flavor it. You want wine. You want wine. I want wine. I don't have a cup. I want wine. So I'm dunking the pasa babakistin into the yayin, not because I want to flavor the cake. It's because I want wine. Or I'm dunking it into the schnapps because I want schnapps. Maybe it's hard for me to drink the schnapps straight. Maybe the guy has acid reflux problems like me, and to drink schnapps straight is going to burn a hole. So he's dunking the schnapps into the cake as a means of drinking the schnapps. Avalim kavanos gam b'shvil shtiyas hayayin. Sheroitza lecha v'lishtois b'yachad. He wants to eat cake, but he also wants to have the schnapps. Then says the Chavetz Chaim, Nachain, it would be proper, sheyevarech mitchila al ktsas yayin b'fnei atzmai bari priagofen. The proper thing to do would be to make a bari priagofen first on some straight wine, va'achakach yevarech bracha ala pasa shorui, then go ahead and make mezainos on this mezainos bread that you soaked, the bread that you soaked that became mezainos because you lost tayar lechem. So, what's the problem over here? The problem over here is, says the Chavetz Chaim, if you're soaking pasa babakistin, or you're soaking pieces of bread that are less than a kazayas in red wine, so it loses tayar lechem and it's a mezainos, but you really want the wine also, now we have a shtickle of suffix. Maybe you have to make a hagafen on this wine. Maybe the hagafen is not a tuffle, but it's a suffix. It's a suffix because you're not drinking the wine, you're eating it together with the cake. How do you get out of the suffix? How do you get out of the suffix? The way you get out of the suffix, says the Chavetz Chaim, is make a bracha first, bari priagofen, on straight wine. On straight wine, you definitely have to make a bari priagofen. Make a bari priagofen first on straight wine. Now you're going to pater the wine. And then make the bracha on the piece that you're soaking in the wine. Vim kavanasai rak b'shvil hayayin shabai. Now, how about if you only want the wine? V'apas ba rak lamatek ashtia. Now it's the other way around from the first case. Now what we have over here is, really you only want the schnapps. But like I said, you got acid reflux problems. I want the schnapps. I don't want the cake at all. I'm on a diet. I don't want to eat the cake. But my way of getting the schnapps is by eating the cake that I dunked in the schnapps. Then nasa apas tafel yayin. Then the bread or the cake becomes a tafel to the yayin. Veinim of arach rak bari priagofen. You only make a bari priagofen. V'hine, lefizeh, according to this, against this backdrop, says the Mishnah Berurah, le'inyan shtiyas kaveh hanoig beinenu. When it comes to drinking coffee, shetoivlin by pas kisnin, A lot of people, they drink coffee, they take a donut, they dunk it. The donut is pasa babikistin. They take a donut and they dunk it in the coffee. Shetoivlim by paskistin. Visham, and in that case, haloi kavanasa gamke bishvil shteim. Over there's no question that the guy wants both. Guy sat down in shul after davening, he made himself a coffee, and he's sitting down with a coffee and a donut. There's no question he wants the donut, he wants the coffee. So over here, you cannot say that the coffee is a tuffle, you cannot say that the coffee is a tuffle to the donut, nor can you say that the donut is a tuffle to the coffee. They're both ikrim. I want the coffee, I want the donut. What do you do then? So certainly, you're going to have to make a berachah on both. So v'hinei lefi zeh, l'nishtias kaveh anoy b'nein, she'toivlim by pas kisnin, v'sham, and in that case, haloi kavanasa gamkein b'shul shteim. The person certainly wants both. Nira gamkein, it would seem, says the Chavetz Chaim, the nachain hu, that the proper course of action should be, she'koidim she'birich ala pas kisnin, before you make a mezainos on the donut, Yevarech ala kave, you should make a shahakal on the coffee. Shahakal. You should make a shahakal on the coffee, v'yishtem and drink a little bit of coffee. Now, what's interesting about this is, again, what you're doing over here is you're dunking a donut in coffee. And what the Mishnah Berurah is saying is, if you're dunking a donut in coffee, you definitely want the donut and you definitely want the coffee. And it would seem that since you definitely want both, you should have to make both berachos. You should have to make a mezainos and you should have to make a shahakal. Says the Mishnah Berurah, what should you do? First, you should drink some plain coffee and make a shahakal on the coffee. Now, what's interesting about that is that he's telling you to make a shahakal before you make a mezainos. Normally, mezainos always comes before shahakal. But over here, he's telling you to make a shahakal before the mezainos. And it would seem that the reason he's telling you that is because he's very nervous about making a shahakal on the coffee after you make a mezainos on the donut. Once you made a mezainos on the donut, you see, to say that the mezainos donut is a tuffle to the shahakal coffee, that's very not likely. But to say that the shahakal coffee is a tuffle to the mezainos donut, that's much easier. And therefore, the Chavetz Chaim is not very comfortable telling you, go ahead, make a mezainos on the donut, and then make a shahakal on the coffee. Because once you made a mezainos on the donut, it's all too likely that since you're dunking the donut into the coffee and you're having coffee together with the donut, that the mezainos on the donut already pattered the shahakal on the coffee. So what does he tell you? Make a shahakal on the coffee first, because it's highly unlikely that the shahakal on the coffee is going to patter the mezainos donut. Mezainos is dagan, mine dagan. Mine dagan don't become a tuffle very easily. So therefore, make a shahakal on straight coffee. Then make a mezainos. But now, says the Mishnah Berurah, for yoiser toiv, what would be even better would be sheyevarech betchila ala pas kistin levad beloy shriya. Make a mezainos on the donut without dunking it into the coffee. Va'achakach, and after that, yevarech mitchila al ma'at zucker berachah shahakal lahitzia coffee. The best thing would be, says the Mishnah Berurah, let's kriach out of this problem of making a shahakal before a mezainos. How will we kriach out of the problem? Make a mezainos on the donut without dunking it in the coffee. Because if you're going to dunk it in the coffee, oh boy, you're building on the suffix. Once you take the donut and you dunk it in the coffee and you have coffee together with the donut, it's very possible that you already pattered the donut. So don't dunk the donut in the coffee. Make a mezainos on straight coffee. Now, don't go ahead and make a shahakal on straight coffee. Why? Because since you're sitting down to eat the donut together with the coffee, and you're going to be dunking the donut in the coffee, it's still possible that the mezainos on the donut pattered the coffee, even though you ate it straight. But I want you to make a shahakal. I don't want to tell you to make a shahakal on straight coffee anymore. Once you made a mezainos on the donut, you're going to dunk into the coffee. So what should you do? Take a teaspoon of sugar, make a shahakal on a teaspoon of sugar, that's not pattered by the donut. You didn't patter the sugar with the mezainis on the donut. So make a shahakal on a teaspoon of sugar, having in mind that shahakal should patter the coffee, and in that way you'll patter both the coffee and the donut. A fascinating ice cutting in Mishnah Berurah over here. Okay, let's just see one more ice cut here in Mishnah Berurah. Ice cut in Samach Vav. The Mechaber had said over here that, of course, this halacha of Sif Yud Beis, where if you're soaking pieces of bread in yayin odoib, in red wine, it becomes a mezainos. The Mechaber said, of course, that's only talking about if the pieces are smaller than a kazayas. If the pieces are bigger than a kazayas, of course they're hamoitzi. Even if you cook them, for sure you lost tire lechem. It's still hamoitzi. Says the Mishnah Berurah cutting samach vav. By kazayas. If the pieces were kazayas, haloi mavur le'el b'sif yud. We explained already in sif yud in scenario number 1 where you cooked the pieces. The mevarach hamoitzi where you make a hamoitzi afilu b'sha'avat tire lechem. Even though you cooked the pieces of bread and you lost tire lechem, since it's a kazayas, you make hamoitzi. So too over here, if you take a kazayas of bread and you soak it in red wine, it's still hamoitzi even though you lost Tayar lechem. I hope that this was very clear. There's a lot of complications over here, and we're trying at the same time to cover as much ground as possible. I hope that I explained it well. I hope everybody could follow it clearly. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah, discussing limud HaTorah should be made against Klal Yisrael. The Rebbe should send Yeshuas, Refuas, Parnasa, Sheduchim, and we should be zeicher to see the Geula Shlema, B'Bias Gael Tzedek, B'Meherav Yameinu. Amen. Be well.